The music had not stopped, but for Elizabeth Whitmore, the entire ballroom had gone silent. She saw him first, the Duke of Ashbourne, standing near the tall windows, his eyes fixed not on her, but on the man beside her. A man she had never seen before in her life. A man whose hand now rested, with practiced ease, on the small of her back. She watched the Duke's face change. Watched the warmth drain out of it, the way color drains from a face that has just received terrible news. She did not understand what was happening. She only understood that something was being taken from her, in front of 200 people, and she had not been given the chance to stop it. Her aunt's voice reached her, low and satisfied, speaking to someone nearby, but not quite low enough. "A pity, isn't it? Such a charming girl, married so young and to such an unfortunate man." Elizabeth's mouth opened. No sound came out. Across the room, the Duke of Ashbourne turned away. 3 months earlier, none of this would have made any sense to her at all. 3 months before that night, Elizabeth Whitmore's days began at 5 in the morning and ended whenever Lady Beatrice decided they had. She did not live as a servant. That word was never used in the house on Thornfield Lane. She was a niece, a guest, a member of the family, taken in out of Christian charity after her father's death left her with nothing but his debts and his good name, and even the good name was beginning to fray. But a guest does not mend her cousin's torn hems at midnight by candlelight. A guest does not eat her breakfast standing in the kitchen, because the dining room is for family, and the word family somehow never quite stretched far enough to include her at the table. Elizabeth had stopped pointing out the difference. There was no one to point it out to. "Elizabeth," Cordelia's voice rang down the stairs, sharp with the particular impatience of a girl who had never once buttoned her own boots. "The blue silk has come loose at the shoulder again. You must fix it before the Ashbourne dinner." "Yes, Cordelia." Elizabeth set down the mending she had already been doing and climbed the stairs. The Ashbourne dinner. The whole household had spoken of little else for a week. The new Duke, young, unmarried, recently returned to claim the estate after the death of his uncle, was to dine at a neighboring house, and Lady Beatrice had spent considerable effort ensuring her own family received an invitation soon after. "He is said to be very serious," Cordelia said, turning so Elizabeth could examine the torn seam. "Mother says serious men make the best husbands. They do not waste money on foolishness." "That sounds very practical," Elizabeth murmured, threading her needle. "You wouldn't know anything about it." It wasn't said unkindly. Cordelia rarely meant to be unkind, only thoughtless, but it landed all the same. "You'll be at home that evening, I expect. Mother didn't mention your name on the invitation." Elizabeth kept her eyes on the silk. "No, I don't expect she did." This was the shape of her life, and she had long since stopped expecting it to take any other shape. She was 23 years old, unmarried, with no dowry to speak of and no mother to arrange one even if there had been money for it. Her father in his last years had made decisions about money, about a man named Silas Crane, about debts she only half understood, that she suspected would shadow her for a long time yet. Lady Beatrice never spoke of those debts directly. She only reminded Elizabeth in small ways, almost daily, exactly how much she owed her aunt's household for the roof over her head. She finished the seam in silence and was dismissed without thanks. It was nearly evening, 2 days before the Ashbourne dinner, when Elizabeth's life changed direction. Quietly, the way most important things do, without any warning that they are important at all. She had been sent to the village with a basket of mending to deliver to old Mrs. Tilden, who took in extra sewing work for the great houses. The road back ran along the edge of the Ashbourne estate, where the hedgerows grew tall and the lane narrowed to barely the width of a carriage. She heard the horse before she saw it, a fast, hard gallop, far too fast for that stretch of road, and she had only a moment to step back against the hedge before the rider came around the bend. He saw her at the last possible second. The horse reared. The man fought it down with a sharp, controlled hand, and for several long seconds the animal danced sideways across the lane while Elizabeth pressed herself flat against the thorny hedge, heart pounding. "Are you hurt?" The voice was low, urgent, entirely unlike the careless drawl of the gentleman who occasionally visited Lady Beatrice's house. He was off the horse before it had fully settled, crossing the distance between them in 3 strides. "I didn't see you until, forgive me. Are you hurt?" "No," Elizabeth found her voice, though it shook slightly. "No, I'm quite well, you needn't." She looked up properly for the first time, and the rest of the sentence simply left her. He was younger than she expected, though something in his bearing made him seem older, a stillness about him, as though he had learned somewhere the value of saying less rather than more. His coat was well made but unfussy. His dark eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that had nothing performative in it at all. He was not looking at her the way men looked at women they wished to flatter. He was looking at her the way a man looks at someone he has nearly, genuinely harmed. "You're certain," he said. "You're pale." "I am always pale. It is a family failing." The words came out before she could stop them, dry and a little sharp, and she watched astonished as the corner of his mouth moved, almost a smile. "Then I am relieved to have caused you no new ones." He paused. "You're not from the village, I'd remember." "I live with my aunt, Lady Beatrice, at Thornfield." She gestured vaguely down the lane. "I was only delivering mending." Something shifted in his expression, recognition, perhaps, or simple curiosity. "Thornfield. Then we are nearly neighbors and have not yet been introduced. Ashbourne." He said it simply, without ceremony, as though the title were an inconvenience he carried rather than a banner he waved. "Julian Hartley." Elizabeth went very still. The Ashbourne, the serious young duke whose dinner invitations Lady Beatrice had spent a week scheming over. The man whose name was not on the guest list beside her own, because her own name had not been written down at all. He was watching her face with open interest, waiting. "Elizabeth," she managed. "Elizabeth Whitmore." "Miss Whitmore." He inclined his head, and there was nothing in his manner of the impatience Cordelia had predicted, nothing serious in the cold sense the word usually implied, only a kind of careful attention, as if she were a question he intended to think about later. "I am very sorry to have frightened you, and very glad," he added, with the faintest, unguarded warmth, "that the road was no narrower." He gathered the horse's reins, but he did not immediately mount. For a moment longer he simply stood there, in the lengthening evening light, looking at her as though he had stumbled onto something he had not expected to find on that particular stretch of road. "I hope," he said finally, "that we will be introduced properly and soon." Then he was gone, the sound of hooves fading down the lane, and Elizabeth stood alone in the hedgerow with her empty basket, and her heart beating far too quickly for a woman who had merely had a near miss with a horse. She did not know, as she walked the rest of the way home in the gathering dark, that she had just been seen, truly seen, for perhaps the first time in 3 years, by the one man in the county whose attention her aunt would soon decide was far too dangerous to allow. She did not know that Lady Beatrice was, at that very moment, standing at an upstairs window with a small, displeased frown, watching the Duke of Ashbourne's horse disappear down the lane from her niece's direction, and beginning already to think. Lady Beatrice did not raise her voice. She never needed to. In 20 years of widowhood she had learned that a quiet word, delivered at the right moment, did far more damage than any shout, and so, when she summoned Elizabeth to her sitting room that evening, her tone was almost pleasant. "You met the Duke of Ashbourne on the road today." It was not a question. Elizabeth, still in her traveling cloak, felt the floor shift slightly beneath her. "His horse nearly ran me down, Aunt. I could hardly have avoided him." "I'm not accusing you of arranging it." Beatrice did not look up from the letter she was writing. "I am only noting that it happened, and that you will not mention it again to anyone in this house or to him, should you have the misfortune of meeting him a second time." "Why would it be a misfortune?" Now Beatrice did look up, and there was something in her pale eyes that made Elizabeth wish she had not asked. Because, my dear, you have nothing to offer a duke, and a duke has nothing to offer you but embarrassment. Cordelia will be introduced to him properly, with my blessing and her father's name behind her. You will be introduced to nothing at all, because there is nothing for you to be introduced as asterisk. Do you understand me? Elizabeth understood. She had understood for 3 years. She said nothing, and after a moment Beatrice returned to her letter, and the conversation, if it could be called that, was over. What Elizabeth did not understand, what she would not understand for many weeks yet, was that her aunt's sharpness that evening had very little to do with Cordelia's prospects, and a great deal to do with a letter that had arrived that very morning, addressed to Lady Beatrice in a hand she recognized with a small, cold drop of dread. The letter was from a man named Silas Crane, and Lady Beatrice had been dreading it for the better part of a year. The history was not complicated, only ugly. Elizabeth's father, in the last desperate seasons of his life, had borrowed heavily from Crane, a tradesman turned moneylender, a man of no particular birth but considerable patience, to keep his household afloat after a string of bad investments. The debt had not died with him. Debts rarely did. It had passed, as such things sometimes do when there is no estate left to settle it properly, into a kind of obligation that hung over the only family member left standing, Elizabeth herself, and by extension, the aunt who had taken her in. Beatrice had paid what she could, quietly, for 2 years, drawing down funds that should have gone toward Cordelia's wardrobe and Cordelia's season and Cordelia's eventual, advantageous marriage. She had told no one, not Cordelia, not the servants, certainly not Elizabeth, who she suspected would feel some misplaced sense of duty about it if she knew. But the most recent letter was not a request. It was a demand, and it named a sum Beatrice could not produce without selling property she had no intention of selling. I have been patient, Crane had written in his careful, self-taught hand, but patience is not without its limits, Lady Beatrice. Your late brother-in-law's debts do not forgive themselves with time. I would be glad to discuss terms that might satisfy us both, if you are willing to receive me. Beatrice read the letter 3 times before she burned it. She was not a cruel woman, whatever Elizabeth might privately believe of her. She was a frightened one, which was often worse. She had a daughter to settle, a household to maintain, and a dead brother-in-law's debts hanging over her like a debt collector's shadow. And now, on top of all of it, a niece who had somehow, through no scheming of her own, caught the eye of the one man in the county wealthy enough to make every one of those problems disappear, if only he were looking at the right girl. It was not fair. Beatrice was aware that it was not fair. She decided that night that she did not particularly care. Silas Crane arrived at Thornfield 3 days later, unannounced, in a hired carriage that he clearly could not yet afford but intended, eventually, to be able to. He was shown into Beatrice's private sitting room, and the door was closed. He was not an unhandsome man, in the way that ambition sometimes lends a man a kind of hungry vitality. But there was something in the set of his mouth, something calculating and patient at once, that made even Beatrice, who had summoned him herself, faintly uneasy. Lady Beatrice. He did not bow so much as incline, just enough to satisfy form. I had hoped we might discuss the matter more comfortably than by letter. You said you were willing to discuss terms. I am. He took the seat she did not offer him, which she noted and did not comment on. I find myself, Lady Beatrice, in want of a wife. Beatrice went very still. I beg your pardon. Your niece, Miss Whitmore. Crane said it as though he were discussing the terms of a property sale, which, in his own mind, he very nearly was. Her father's debt is considerable, and I am told she has no dowry and no other prospects to speak of. I am prepared to forgive the debt entirely, every shilling of it, Lady Beatrice, a debt that has cost you a great deal these 2 years, if I'm not mistaken, in exchange for her hand. She would never agree to it. Then perhaps, Crane said, with the faint, unhurried smile of a man who had already thought several steps ahead. She need not be asked in quite so many words. He let that sit in the room for a moment before continuing, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something quieter, more confiding, the voice of a man offering a colleague a solution to a shared problem. I do not require a wedding tomorrow, Lady Beatrice. I understand these things take delicacy. What I require for now is something far simpler, an understanding, a small fiction, if you like, told to the right people at the right moment that Miss Whitmore is already spoken for, already in fact married quietly to a man of business who keeps her circumstances modest and her name out of society pages. It would explain a great deal, I think. Her lack of a season, her lack of suitors. It would explain, he added, watching her carefully, anyone who might otherwise begin to take an inconvenient interest in her. Beatrice's mind went, unwillingly, to the image of her niece standing in the lane 2 days before, the Duke of Ashbourne's horse rearing beside her, his eyes fixed on her face with an attention Beatrice had not liked at all. "You are very well informed for a man who has only just arrived in the county," she said slowly. Crane only smiled. "I make it my business to be informed, Lady Beatrice. It is, after all, how I knew to come to you in the first place." She did not answer him immediately. She rose instead, crossed to the window, and looked out over the darkening garden, where somewhere beyond the hedges the lights of Ashbourne Park were just beginning to show against the evening sky. A small fiction, a few words said to the right people, the debt forgiven, Cordelia's prospects protected, and a niece who, Beatrice told herself, already beginning to believe it, would never have been suited to a duke's attention in any case. It would resolve itself in time. These things always did. "It would need to be done carefully," she said at last, without turning around. "And it would need to be done soon, before the Ashbourne dinner." "Lady Beatrice," Crane's voice carried real satisfaction now, "I have always admired a woman who understands the value of timing." Outside, the last light was fading from the sky, and in her room upstairs, Elizabeth Whitmore sat by her window, thinking, for reasons she could not entirely explain to herself, of a pair of dark, careful eyes, and a voice that had said "I hope we will be introduced properly, and soon," as though he had meant it. She did not yet know how soon, or how wrong, that introduction would be. The invitation to the Ashbourne dinner arrived the next morning, addressed, to Lady Beatrice's visible astonishment, not only to herself and Cordelia, but to Miss E. Whitmore as well, in a hand that was unmistakably the Duke's own. Beatrice read it twice before setting it down very carefully on the breakfast table, as though it might catch fire. "He must have asked the hostess to include you," she said, in a voice stripped of all its usual warmth. "There is no other explanation." Elizabeth, for her part, felt something rise in her chest that she did not allow herself to examine too closely. Hope, perhaps, or simply the rare, unfamiliar sensation of being seen by someone who had not yet learned to overlook her. She should have known her aunt would not allow it to remain so simple. The dinner, when it came, was a quiet agony of small humiliations dressed up as courtesy. Beatrice seated Cordelia as near the Duke as etiquette allowed, and Elizabeth as far as it permitted without open rudeness. But place settings, it turned out, mattered a great deal less than Beatrice had hoped. The Duke found her anyway. He found her in the music room afterward, where she had retreated to avoid the card tables, and he asked, without preamble, in the same direct manner he'd used on the road, whether she played. "Badly," she admitted. "My aunt considers it time better spent on mending." "Then I am glad of the mending's loss." He did not sit, but he did not leave either, and for nearly 20 minutes they spoke of nothing of any consequence. A book she had read, a horse he had nearly ruined his neck on as a boy, the unreasonable coldness of the music room in autumn, and Elizabeth found, with something like alarm, that she had laughed 3 times before she remembered to be careful. He did not ask why she had not been at any of the season's other gatherings. He did not ask why her gown was 2 years out of fashion while her cousin's was new. He asked her opinion, and then he listened to it, which was a thing so unfamiliar to Elizabeth that she nearly did not recognize it for what it was. When he finally took his leave of her that evening, he held her gaze a moment longer than courtesy required. "I find myself hoping, Miss Whitmore, that our acquaintance will not end with this evening." From across the room, Lady Beatrice watched, and her face was perfectly composed, and inside she was already rewriting her plans. It took her 4 days to act, and when she did, she chose her moment with care. A small afternoon gathering at Ashbourne Park itself, where she contrived, through a series of perfectly natural-seeming maneuvers, to find herself alone with the Duke near the orangery, while Elizabeth and Cordelia walked the garden paths ahead. "Your Grace." Beatrice's voice was soft, regretful, the voice of a woman performing a reluctant duty. "I wonder if I might speak frankly. As her aunt, I feel a certain obligation." "Of course." Julian's attention sharpened immediately, in the way of a man who has learned to be wary of conversations that begin this way. "I have noticed your attentions to my niece, and I confess I am troubled because I do not believe she has been entirely honest with you or with anyone in truth. It is not malice on her part, only shame, I think, and a kind of pride that will not let her speak of it." Beatrice paused, as though gathering courage she did not need. "Elizabeth is married, Your Grace, has been quietly for some 2 years now. Her husband is a man of business, of no great fortune, and the match was not a happy one, I am sorry to say. She does not wear a ring because he does not provide for her in any visible way, and the arrangement is one she finds painful to discuss. I had hoped, foolishly, that she might find some small comfort in your friendship. I did not anticipate that the friendship might become anything more, or I would have spoken sooner." Julian said nothing for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was carefully even, though something in it had gone very still. "You are certain of this?" "I have known it for 2 years, Your Grace. I would not speak of it now if I did not feel I owed you the truth, given how things appear to have progressed. Why has no one else ever mentioned a husband? Why does she go nowhere with him? Why does she live in your house, mend your daughter's gowns, and dine at your table like an unmarried girl?" The questions were sharper than Beatrice had expected, and for a moment she felt the ground shift beneath her own careful construction. But she had not survived 20 years of widowhood without learning to think quickly. "Because she is ashamed, Your Grace, and because I have allowed her the dignity of keeping it quiet. If you doubt me," and here Beatrice played her final card, the one Crane had supplied her, "you need only see for yourself. He will be in attendance at the Hartwell ball next week. I am told he intends to call on her there. I had hoped to keep him from doing so, but I no longer believe I can." Julian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I see." "I am so very sorry, Your Grace. I had no wish to cause you any distress." She left him standing alone by the orangery, and from the garden path below, Elizabeth glanced back once, drawn by some instinct she could not name, and saw the Duke standing very still, his eyes fixed on nothing at all, his face arranged into an expression she had not seen on him before. She had no way of knowing, as she turned back to Cordelia's chatter and the ordinary business of the afternoon, that her aunt had just told the Duke of Ashbourne the first lie of many, or that, within the week, she would watch him believe the worst of it with his own eyes, across a crowded ballroom, with no chance at all to tell him otherwise. Cordelia Ashworth was not a wicked girl. She told herself this often enough in the days that followed that she very nearly believed it. She had not been in the room when her mother spoke to the Duke by the orangery, but she had seen her mother's face afterward, that particular satisfaction Beatrice wore when a difficult problem had been neatly solved, and she had asked, with the bluntness only a daughter can manage, what had happened. Beatrice had told her, not all of it, not Crane, not the debt, not the precise mechanics of the lie, but enough. Enough that Cordelia understood within the space of a single conversation that her cousin's brief, bright happiness was about to be quietly and deliberately extinguished, and that her own mother was the one doing the extinguishing. "She isn't married," Cordelia said slowly. "Elizabeth isn't married to anyone." "It is a small untruth in service of a larger kindness," Beatrice said, not looking up from her needlework. "The Duke would never seriously consider her, Cordelia. He would entertain himself for a season and move on, as such men do, and Elizabeth would be left with nothing, no prospects, no reputation, and a broken heart besides. This way she is spared all of it. And you," here Beatrice did look up, and her eyes were not unkind, only practical, "are spared the indignity of watching your cousin receive an attention that ought to be yours by right of birth." Cordelia did not point out that she had never particularly wanted the Duke's attention for its own sake, only the security it represented, and that the difference had begun to feel important to her lately in ways she could not entirely explain. She did not point out that Elizabeth had never once tried to take anything from her in 3 years of living under the same roof, and did not seem inclined to start now. She said nothing at all. She told herself it was not her place to interfere in her mother's affairs. She told herself a great many things that week that she did not entirely believe. It would be 4 more weeks, 4 weeks of growing unease, of catching Elizabeth's quiet, hopeful glances toward the window whenever a rider passed on the road, of watching her mother's plans tighten like a snare before Cordelia's silence finally broke. But that would come later. For now she said nothing, and the lie continued on its course unchallenged. Elizabeth, meanwhile, knew only that something had changed. The Duke's visits, which had become a quiet, looked-for fixture of her week, simply stopped. There was no note, no explanation, only a silence so complete it felt deliberate, and a single mortifying afternoon when she passed his carriage on the road into the village, and he inclined his head with perfect, distant courtesy and did not stop. She told herself there could be a dozen reasons: estate business, a journey to town, the ordinary indifference of a man who had simply grown bored of an unimportant acquaintance, as men of his standing were entitled to do without explanation to anyone. She did not allow herself to consider, even once, that her own aunt might have had a hand in it. It would not have occurred to her. Whatever else Beatrice was sharp-tongued, exacting, quick to remind Elizabeth of her debts, she was still family, and Elizabeth had not yet learned that family could do this particular kind of harm. She continued her mending. She continued her early mornings and her standing breakfasts in the kitchen, and if she sometimes stood a little longer than necessary at her window in the evenings, watching the lights of Ashbourne Park flicker faint and far across the dark fields, she told no one, and no one asked. It was Lady Beatrice who raised the subject of the Hartwell ball. "You will attend, of course," she told Elizabeth, with a briskness that did not invite discussion. "Cordelia will need looking after, and Mrs. Hartwell has been gracious enough to extend the invitation to the whole household." Elizabeth, who had not expected to be included at all, felt that same unwise flicker of hope rekindle, small and stubborn, in her chest. The Duke would surely be there. Perhaps whatever silence had fallen between them could be undone with a single conversation, a single honest question asked plainly. She did not know that her aunt had specifically requested the invitation extend to her. She did not know that a man named Silas Crane had already received, by separate and far more private correspondence, an invitation of his own, arranged quietly, through a contact of Beatrice's, under a name, and a story carefully constructed for exactly one purpose. She spent the days before the ball in a state of cautious, carefully suppressed hope, choosing her best gown worn but freshly pressed, and rehearsing, in the privacy of her own mind, all the things she might say to him if given the chance. She had no way of knowing that the chance she was hoping for would arrive in the worst possible form. Not a private word, not an honest question, but a public tableau, engineered down to the last detail, designed to answer every question the Duke might have about her, with an answer that was entirely untrue. The ballroom was 3 days away. Lady Beatrice had already sent word to Mr. Crane confirming the arrangements. And across the fields, in his quiet study at Ashbourne Park, Julian Hartley sat with an unopened letter, Beatrice's careful, regretful confirmation that he would be in attendance, just as she had promised, and felt something in his chest go cold and resolved in a way he did not enjoy, but could not quite seem to stop. The Hartwell ballroom was ablaze with candlelight by the time Elizabeth arrived, the great hall already filled with the bright noise of music and conversation, and for the first quarter hour she allowed herself to hope that the evening might, after all, turn out well. She saw him almost at once across the room, near the tall windows, speaking with their host, and her heart lifted painfully at the sight of him, dark-coated and grave as ever, before she remembered the silence of the past month and made herself look away. She did not see him approach Mr. Hartwell's circle a second time. She did not see the brief, low conversation in which Lady Beatrice, drifting past with practiced casualness, mentioned that the gentleman in question had arrived after all, and gestured discreetly, almost kindly, toward a man Elizabeth had never once met. She only knew that Cordelia appeared at her elbow, flushed and oddly insistent, and steered her by the arm toward the refreshment table, where a stranger stood waiting. "Elizabeth, you must meet someone," Cordelia said, too brightly, not quite meeting her eyes. "A friend of Mother's, Mr. Crane." The man who turned to face her was perhaps 40, well-dressed in a way that tried slightly too hard, with a smile that did not reach his eyes. He took her gloved hand before she could quite withdraw it. "Miss Whitmore, I have heard a very great deal about you." "I'm afraid I don't believe we've met, sir." Elizabeth tried gently to extract her hand. "I don't recall." "No," he agreed with a small, unreadable smile. "I don't suppose you would." It was such a strange thing to say that Elizabeth nearly asked him to explain himself. But Cordelia was already talking again, too quickly, about the music, about the heat of the room, about anything at all that might fill the silence, and Elizabeth, glancing past her cousin's shoulder, felt the floor tilt beneath her. The Duke was watching them, watching her, standing close to a strange man who had just claimed, in some unspoken way, an intimacy she did not understand. And his face, across the width of the ballroom, had gone the way a face goes when something long suspected is finally, devastatingly confirmed. She tried to step back. Crane's hand found the small of her back instead, light, proprietary, exactly the gesture of a man with every right to make it, and he leaned in to murmur something about the orchestra that she did not hear, because every part of her attention had narrowed to the Duke's face, 40 feet away, going cold. "Excuse me," she said, too sharply, pulling free at last. "I need air." But it was already too late. She turned in time to see him say something brief to his host, to see him incline his head to Lady Beatrice, who stood near enough to have arranged the angle herself, and to watch him turn, deliberately, and walk toward the far doors. He did not look back. "Your Grace." Elizabeth started forward, but the crowd had closed between them, a wall of silk and conversation she could not push through fast enough, and by the time she reached the doors he had already gone, his carriage already pulling away down the drive, and she was left standing alone on the steps in the cold night air with no earthly idea what she had just lost, or why. Behind her in the ballroom, Lady Beatrice allowed herself, for just a moment, the smallest and most private of smiles. She did not see Mr. Crane again that evening. He had done what he was paid to do, and slipped away before the dancing resumed, his part in the small, cruel performance complete. She did not learn, that night or for some time after, precisely what had been said of her, or to whom, or why the Duke's face had closed against her so completely and so suddenly. She knew only that something irrevocable had happened in that ballroom, that whatever fragile, hopeful thing had been growing between them these past weeks had been crushed, deliberately, by someone's hand, though whose hand and why remained, for now, entirely beyond her understanding. She rode home in silence beside her aunt and cousin, staring out at the dark fields, replaying the Duke's face over and over. The moment the warmth had gone out of it, the moment he had simply, finally, stopped looking at her at all. She did not cry. She had long ago trained herself out of crying where anyone could see. But that night, alone in her small room at Thornfield, she allowed herself, for the first time in 3 years, to weep for something she had only just realized she'd allowed herself to want. And across the dark fields at Ashbourne Park, the Duke of Ashbourne sat alone in his study long past midnight, a glass of brandy untouched at his elbow, staring into the fire and trying, without success, to understand why the sight of Elizabeth Whitmore standing beside another man had felt less like disappointment and far more like grief. Lady Beatrice did not waste time enjoying her victory. Victories, in her experience, had a way of unraveling if left too long unattended, and so within 3 days of the Hartwell ball she had already set the next part of her plan in motion. "You will go to my cousin Margaret in Lyme," she told Elizabeth over breakfast, in the same brisk tone she might have used to announce a change in the weather. "She has need of a governess for her 2 youngest, and I have already written to recommend you. You will leave at the end of the week." Elizabeth set down her cup very carefully, aware of how unsteady her hand had become. "Aunt, I don't understand. Have I displeased you in some way?" "Not at all." Beatrice did not look up from her letters. "It is simply time you had some occupation of your own, some independence. You are 23, Elizabeth. You cannot mend Cordelia's gowns forever, and Margaret pays a fair wage. I think you will find it a far better situation than the one you have here." It was, on its surface, almost reasonable, almost kind, even dressed up as it was in the language of opportunity. And Elizabeth, who had spent 3 years learning not to ask too many questions of the household that fed and sheltered her, found she had no real grounds to refuse. She had no money of her own. She had no other roof to go to. She had, in the end, no choice at all, and some small, exhausted part of her recognized that her aunt had known this when she made the arrangement, just as she had known it 3 years ago when Elizabeth's father died, and there had been nowhere else for his daughter to go. She did not ask why the timing felt so deliberate. She did not connect it, not yet, not fully, to the ballroom, to the Duke's retreating back, to the strange man named Crane whose face she could not quite stop seeing when she closed her eyes. She told herself it was only her own raw feelings making connections where none existed. She was wrong, but she would not learn how wrong for some weeks yet. She packed what little she owned into a single trunk that had once been her mother's, and on the morning of her departure, Cordelia came to her room, unusual in itself, since Cordelia rarely rose before 10 and stood in the doorway with an expression Elizabeth had never seen on her cousin's face before, something that looked almost like shame. "I'm sorry," Cordelia said abruptly before Elizabeth could ask what was wrong. I can't explain. But I am sorry, Elizabeth, for all of it." "For all of what?" Elizabeth folded a shawl with hands that had gone very still. "Cordelia, what do you mean?" But Cordelia only shook her head, tears standing suddenly in her eyes, and fled the room before she could say anything more, leaving Elizabeth standing alone amid her half-packed trunk, with the distinct and unsettling sense that there was a great deal happening around her that she did not understand, and that perhaps had never been meant for her to understand at all. She left Thornfield 2 hours later in a hired carriage, with a single trunk, a small purse of coin that represented the whole of her savings, and a heart that ached in a way she could not entirely account for, given that nothing, on the surface, nothing at all had actually happened to her. No one had wronged her. No one had said an unkind word to her face. And yet she felt, as the carriage pulled away down the long drive, as though she were being carried away from something enormous and unfinished, something she would spend a long time afterward trying to name. She did not look back at the house. She did look once toward the distant line of trees that marked the edge of Ashbourne Park, and she thought, with a small and private and entirely useless ache, of dark eyes on a country lane, and a voice that had said "I hope we will be introduced properly and soon." She did not know that those words had already, in some sense, come true and gone, that the introduction had happened, the worst possible version of it, in a crowded ballroom under candlelight, without her ever having had the chance to speak in her own defense. At Ashbourne Park, the Duke of Ashbourne was discovering that a man could be perfectly correct in his conduct, perfectly composed in his manner, and still feel, every single day, as though something essential had gone missing from his life. He did not speak of Elizabeth Whitmore. He did not visit Thornfield, did not seek out Lady Beatrice's company at the gatherings he could not avoid, did not ask after the household in even the most casual way. He told himself this was simple good sense. A man did not pursue a married woman, however much her face appeared unbidden in the quiet moments before sleep, and he told himself with rather less conviction that the matter was closed. It was nearly 3 weeks after the Hartwell ball that he found the handkerchief. It had fallen, unnoticed, behind the cushion of a chair in his own study, the very chair Elizabeth had sat in, weeks before, during one of her rare visits to Ashbourne Park with her aunt and cousin, while he had shown her, at her own quiet request, the small collection of books his uncle had left behind in the library. He had forgotten the visit almost entirely, buried as it was beneath everything that came after. But there was the handkerchief, plain linen, edged with a careful, unpretentious embroidery that he recognized at once. The same neat, patient stitches he had seen on a dozen small things about Lady Beatrice's house, stitches that were never Cordelia's work, because Cordelia, it was generally known, had no patience for needlework at all. He sat for a long time with the handkerchief in his hand, turning it over, and found himself thinking, not for the first time, but for the first time with any real clarity, of certain things that did not quite fit together as neatly as Lady Beatrice's story required. A married woman who lived, by all appearances, exactly as an unmarried dependent relation might live. A married woman with no ring, no household of her own, no husband ever once seen or named by anyone but her aunt. A married woman who mended her cousin's hems and ate her breakfast standing in the kitchen, and who had looked at him, on a quiet country lane and a dozen times since, with an honesty so unguarded it had seemed, at the time, entirely incapable of deceit. He thought of the man at the ball, Crane. He believed the name had been, and tried, for the first time, to recall anything substantial he actually knew about him. He could recall nothing. No history, no connections, no mention from anyone in the county before that single evening when he had appeared, conveniently, at precisely the moment his presence was most needed to confirm a story Julian had, until that moment, accepted entirely on Lady Beatrice's word. He sat very still in the dimming light of his study, the handkerchief held loosely in his hand, and felt the first cold thread of doubt begin to unspool inside him, slow at first, and then, as he turned the facts over one more time, considerably less slow. He rang for his steward before the candle had burned another inch. "Have someone make inquiries," he said when the man appeared, quietly, "about a Mr. Silas Crane. I want to know where he comes from, who employs him, and why." It was a small thing, a single question, asked in a single evening, born of nothing more than a forgotten handkerchief, and a doubt he could not quite explain even to himself. But 3 counties away, in a borrowed bed in a cousin's house in Lyme, Elizabeth Whitmore slept with the particular, dreamless exhaustion of a woman who believes, wrongly, though she does not yet know it, that the worst has already happened, and that there is nothing left now but to endure it. Chapter 7, What the Inquiries Found. Lyme was nothing like Thornfield, and for the first week Elizabeth told herself this was a mercy. Margaret Price was a widow of comfortable but unspectacular means, kind in an absent, harried sort of way, with 2 small daughters, Anne, aged 7, and Lucy, aged 5, who took to their new governess with the swift, uncomplicated affection of children who have simply been waiting for someone to pay attention to them. The schoolroom was small but bright, overlooking a garden gone slightly wild with autumn. And for the first time in 3 years, Elizabeth found herself addressed by a title that was entirely her own. Not niece, not guest, not an obligation tolerated under someone else's roof, but Miss Whitmore, the governess, with a wage of her own and a room of her own and a door that locked from the inside. It should have felt like freedom. In some narrow, practical sense it did. But in the quiet hours after the girls were put to bed, when the house grew still and there was nothing left to occupy her hands or her mind, Elizabeth found that freedom and happiness were not, after all, quite the same thing. She thought of Ashbourne Park more often than she would have liked to admit, of a library full of books shown to her with quiet, careful pride, of a man who had asked her opinion, and then actually listened to her answer, of the particular silence of a country lane at dusk, and a voice saying, "I hope we will be introduced properly, and soon." She thought, too, of the ballroom, of the stranger's hand at her back, of the Duke's face, going cold and final across a room full of candlelight, and the carriage pulling away down the drive before she could reach the doors. She had turned the evening over so many times in her mind that the details had worn smooth, like a stone handled too often, and still she could not make sense of it. She had done nothing. She had said nothing to encourage the stranger, had in fact tried to step away from him the moment she could. And yet the Duke had looked at her as though she had betrayed him personally, as though some private understanding between them had been broken beyond repair. And he had given her no chance, none at all, to explain that there was nothing to explain. She wrote twice, a letter she did not send. There was nothing she could say that would not sound either desperate or mad. "Your Grace, I do not know why you looked at me as you did, or who that man was, or why my aunt seemed so pleased by all of it." She burned both attempts in the schoolroom grate and told herself firmly that it was for the best. A duke did not owe explanations to a governess in Lyme. Whatever had passed between them in those few brief weeks had been, in the end, exactly as fragile and unlikely as she ought to have known it was from the beginning. She did not yet understand that the very thing she found impossible to explain, the suddenness of it, the strangeness, the sense of a script being followed by everyone but herself, was the precise thing that had begun, 3 counties away, to trouble the Duke of Ashbourne far more than her absence ever could. It took Julian Stewart 11 days to bring back an answer, and when he did, it was not the answer Julian had expected. Silas Crane, Your Grace, is not a man of business in any meaningful sense, not the sort that keeps offices or holds respectable accounts in any case. He is, by every report I could gather, a moneylender. A small one, working mostly among families fallen on hard times, the sort who borrow quietly and repay even more quietly, so as not to be seen doing either. Julian set down the report he had been pretending to read. "Go on." "He has one significant outstanding account at present, Your Grace, that my inquiries could trace, a debt some 2 years old, inherited from the estate of a Mr. Whitmore deceased, and presently owed by his sister-in-law, a Lady Beatrice of Thornfield." The room went very quiet. "There is more, Your Grace, though I cannot say how reliable it is. It comes from a tavern-keeper in the next county who Crane was unwise enough to confide in over several glasses of brandy. He claims Crane spoke, some weeks past, of an arrangement he had recently concluded favorable terms. He called it, in exchange for a small service rendered to a lady of quality. He did not name the lady. He did imply the service involved attending a ball he otherwise had no business attending, and behaving, for the space of a single evening, as though he held a claim on a young woman he had in fact never met before that night. Julian sat very still for a long moment, the fire popping softly in the grate, the full and ugly shape of it assembling itself in his mind piece by piece. The debt, the convenient appearance of a stranger, Lady Beatrice's careful, regretful confession by the orangery, the perfectly timed confirmation at the Hartwell ball. He thought of Elizabeth's face across the ballroom, white and stricken, mouthing something he had been too far away and too wounded to hear. He thought of how quickly, how completely, he had simply believed it all, not because the story had been so very convincing, he realized now, but because some old, wary part of him had been waiting, since his last and far more painful disappointment in love, for precisely this kind of proof that he ought never to trust his own judgment of a woman's character again. He had wanted it to be true in a strange and shameful way. It had been easier to believe Elizabeth dishonest than to believe himself, once again, vulnerable to being made a fool of. The thought sat very badly with him. "Where is Miss Whitmore now?" he asked, and his steward, who had served the family long enough to recognize the particular stillness in his master's voice, answered carefully. "I could not say with certainty, Your Grace. I understand she left Thornfield some weeks past, sent to a relation's household, I believe, though I was not able to learn precisely where." Julian was on his feet before the man had finished speaking. "Find out. Whatever it costs, however long it takes, find out where she has gone and find out today." It was Cordelia, in the end, who made the inquiries unnecessary. She arrived at Ashbourne Park 3 days later, alone, having told her mother she was visiting a friend in the village. A small lie, the first she had ever told Beatrice in her life, and one that sat so uneasily in her chest that she very nearly turned the carriage around twice before she reached the gates. She was shown into the Duke's study white-faced and trembling, and the moment the door closed behind her, the careful, composed manner she had rehearsed the entire drive over abandoned her completely. "It isn't true," she said before he could even greet her properly. "What my mother told you about Elizabeth being married, none of it is true. There is no husband. There never was one. My mother arranged it, Your Grace, with a man named Crane, because Elizabeth's father left a debt that Crane meant to collect one way or another, and my mother she thought it would be simpler, kinder even, to keep you from—" Cordelia stopped, pressed a hand to her mouth, and when she continued her voice had dropped to something raw and ashamed. "I knew. I have known for weeks, and I said nothing, because I did not want to disappoint my mother, and because some small, ugly part of me did not entirely mind that Elizabeth was being kept from a happiness I told myself ought to have been mine instead. I am not proud of it. I have not been able to sleep properly since the ball. I keep thinking of her face, Your Grace, when she realized you had gone." Julian had gone very still, listening, and when Cordelia finally fell silent, wringing her gloved hands in her lap, he found his voice came out far more level than he felt. "Where is she now?" "Lyme, my mother's cousin, Mrs. Price, has need of a governess. Elizabeth left nearly a month ago." Cordelia looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I should have told you sooner. I should have told her, too, before she left, but I was a coward, and now I don't know what either of you might think of me, and I find I cannot blame you if the answer is very little." Julian crossed the room and, to her visible surprise, took her hand briefly, gently. "You have told me now. That is no small thing, Miss Ashworth, and it took more courage than you are giving yourself credit for." He released her hand and was already moving toward the door, already calling for his horse, his coat, his steward, the whole quiet machinery of his household springing suddenly and urgently to life. "Lyme is 2 days hard riding." "Your Grace," Cordelia rose, alarmed. "What will you say to my mother?" He paused at the door, and when he looked back at her, his face held no anger for her at all, only a kind of grim, focused resolve that made him look, for a moment, considerably older than his years. "Nothing for now," he said. "I find I have very little to say to your mother that would not be better said to Miss Whitmore first. Thank you, Miss Ashworth, truly." He was gone within the hour, and Cordelia stood alone in the empty study for a long while afterward, looking out at the long drive down which his horse had already vanished, feeling, for the first time in weeks, something that was not quite relief and not quite dread, but a strange, trembling mixture of both, the particular feeling of a person who has finally set something right after a long time spent watching it go wrong, and does not yet know what the cost of that rightness will turn out to be. The road to Lyme was not an easy one, even for a man with the means to change horses at every coaching inn along the way. And Julian Hartley spent the better part of 2 days learning just how slowly time could move when a person was desperate for it to move quickly. He stopped only when the horses demanded it, slept only when his body gave him no choice, and spent every waking mile turning the whole sorry business over in his mind, examining it from every angle, looking for the places where he might have done better, and finding, to his considerable discomfort, that there were a great many of them. He had believed Lady Beatrice almost instantly. That was the part that troubled him most, more even than the lie itself. He had known Elizabeth Whitmore for scarcely a month, had spoken with her perhaps a dozen times in all, and yet in those dozen conversations he had come to feel he understood something true about her, her quick, dry humor, the careful way she chose her words, the unguarded honesty in her face when she did not think anyone of consequence was watching her closely. None of that, he now realized, had matched the story he had so readily accepted. A woman capable of that kind of quiet honesty was not, he thought, the kind of woman who could have sat across from him for an hour in his own library, allowing him to believe things about her circumstances that were not true without some flicker of guilt crossing her face. He had simply not stopped in the moment to weigh the two things against each other. He had let an old wound speak louder than his own good judgment, and a woman who deserved better than that had paid the price for his carelessness. He thought of his own history briefly, almost against his will, the engagement broken 5 years before, when he had discovered, 2 weeks from the wedding, that the woman he had meant to marry had been carrying on a quiet correspondence with another man the entire length of their courtship. He had told himself after that he had learned a valuable lesson about trusting too quickly, about looking carefully before allowing himself to care. He saw now, with the particular clarity that comes too late to do much good, that the lesson he had actually learned was a far worse one, that the first hint of betrayal, however flimsy, was reason enough to abandon someone entirely rather than ask a single honest question. He had not asked Elizabeth a single honest question. He had simply walked away. By the second evening, riding the last miles into Lyme in the fading light with his horse nearly spent beneath him, he had arrived at a conviction that sat in his chest like a stone. Whatever she said to him when he found her, whatever anger or grief or indifference she greeted him with, and he thought she would be entitled to any of the three, he owed her, at the very least, the apology he had failed to give her a month ago, delivered properly, in person, with no room left for misunderstanding. He did not yet know what he would do if she refused to hear it at all. Mrs. Price's house sat at the edge of the town, modest and neat, with a small garden gone to seed in the early autumn cold, and Julian arrived at its gate in the last gray light of evening, travel-worn and unannounced, with no card to send ahead and no earthly idea how to explain himself to whatever servant answered the door. It was not a servant who answered. It was Elizabeth herself, stepping out into the garden with a small lantern in hand, on her way, evidently, to fetch something from the kitchen garden before full dark, and she stopped dead at the sight of him standing at the gate, mud-spattered and exhausted, looking at her as though she were the only solid thing in a world that had otherwise gone entirely unsteady beneath his feet. For a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. "You're here," she said finally, and her voice was not warm, not yet. It was wary, careful, the voice of a woman who has been hurt once already and has no intention of being made a fool of twice. "I confess I don't understand why." "I know." He stepped through the gate slowly, the way a man approaches something he is afraid of frightening away. "I know I have no right to simply appear at your door after everything. I would have written ahead, but I did not trust a letter to say what needed saying, and I did not trust myself to wait the time it would take to receive your answer." Elizabeth set the lantern down on the low garden wall, her arms crossed against the evening chill, or perhaps against something else entirely. "And what is it that needs saying, Your Grace? You made your feelings on the matter quite clear the last time we were in the same room. I believe the whole of Hartwell's ballroom understood them rather better than I did, in fact. The bitterness in her voice was quiet, restrained, but unmistakable, and Julian found he could not blame her for a single trace of it. "I was wrong," he said simply. "I was told something about you about a husband, an arrangement made some years ago, and I believed it entirely on a single conversation, without ever once asking you whether it was true. I did not give you the chance to deny it. I did not give myself the chance to doubt the person telling me, though I have known her a great deal less time and trust her a great deal less than I had already by then come to trust you. I have spent the past 2 days writing here to tell you that I know now it was a lie manufactured, deliberately, by your aunt, with the help of a man named Crane, in order to keep you from precisely the conversation we are now having. I know it was a lie, Miss Whitmore, and I have come to ask your forgiveness for believing it so easily, even though I am not at all certain I deserve to receive it." Elizabeth had gone very still, the evening wind catching loose strands of her hair, her face unreadable in the lantern light. "My aunt," she repeated slowly, as though testing the shape of the words. "My aunt did this. The man at the ball, he was never—" "He was paid," Julian said gently, "to stand beside you, to behave as though he had some claim on you, for the length of a single evening long enough for me to see it, and to believe what your aunt had already told me in private a week before. There is a debt involved, I understand. Your father's. I do not yet know the whole of it, but I know enough to know that none of it was ever your doing, and that you have spent a great deal of time, I think, paying for choices that were never yours to make." Something in Elizabeth's careful composure finally broke, not into tears, though her eyes had gone bright and unsteady, but into a kind of stunned, disbelieving stillness, as though she were being asked to rebuild, all at once, an entire month of grief and confusion around a foundation that had just shifted completely beneath her. "I wrote you a letter," she said very quietly. "Twice. I burned them both. I did not know what to say that would not sound like madness, that I had done nothing, that I did not understand, that I could not account for why you had looked at me the way you did. I told myself in the end that you simply hadn't cared enough to ask." "I cared a great deal too much to ask," Julian said. "That was rather the trouble. I was afraid of the answer, and so I chose not to risk it, and I let that fear cost us both a month we did not need to lose. I am sorrier for that than I know how to say properly, standing in your cousin's garden with mud on my boots and no earthly right to expect you to forgive me for it." For a long moment, Elizabeth said nothing at all. The lantern flickered between them, and somewhere behind her in the house, a child's voice called faintly for her attention, Lucy, perhaps, wanting a story before bed, and Elizabeth glanced toward the sound, and then back at the man standing in the half-wild garden before her, travel-worn and earnest and entirely unlike the cold, retreating figure she had spent a month trying to make herself stop missing. "I should go in," she said finally. "Lucy will want her story." Julian's face fell just slightly before he caught himself and inclined his head. "Of course. I have imposed enough for one evening. I will take a room in the town and trouble you no further unless—" "I did not say you should leave." Elizabeth's voice was quieter now, less guarded though still careful, still testing the ground beneath the words. "I said I should go in. There is, I think, a great deal more to be said between us, your grace, and I find I am not yet ready to say all of it standing in the cold with my cousin listening from the kitchen window." She paused, and something almost like the beginning of a smile touched the corner of her mouth, fragile but real. "Will you call again tomorrow?" "Properly this time. In daylight with a card sent ahead, like a gentleman who has not just ridden 2 days without sleeping." Relief moved across his face so plainly that Elizabeth, watching it, felt the last of her careful guardedness loosen by some small but significant degree. "I will call at whatever hour you name," he said, "and I will not be late." She picked up her lantern, and at the door she paused, glancing back at him once more across the darkening garden. "Tomorrow, then, your grace." "Tomorrow," he agreed, and watched her go inside, and stood a long while afterward in the cold garden, looking up at the small, lit window where her shadow passed once, twice, across the curtain, feeling, for the first time in a month, as though the worst of it might, after all, be over. He did not yet know that Lady Beatrice, informed by an anxious and guilt-stricken letter from Cordelia of exactly where her niece's affections now stood, was at that very moment composing a letter of her own, one final attempt to control a situation that had, in every way that mattered, already slipped entirely beyond her grasp. Julian called at 9 o'clock the next morning, exactly as promised, with a card sent ahead an hour earlier and a small bouquet of late-season flowers that Mrs. Price's modest garden could not have produced, gathered instead, with some difficulty, from a hothouse 3 streets over. He found Elizabeth in the small front parlor, composed but pale, a letter held loosely in her hand, and the look on her face stopped him in the doorway before he had even finished his bow. "What's happened?" "My aunt has written." Elizabeth held the letter out to him, then seemed to think better of it and set it down instead on the small table between them, as though she did not quite trust herself to remain steady while holding it. "She has heard from Cordelia that you came to Lyme. She does not deny any of it, your grace, not the debt, not Mr. Crane, not the arrangement made at the ball. She writes only to explain herself, to ask me to understand." Julian picked up the letter and read it through once, his jaw tightening by degrees with every line. Lady Beatrice's hand was as steady and composed on the page as it had been across her sitting room 3 months before, and the letter, stripped of its careful phrasing, amounted to a confession dressed up as a defense. She had acted, she wrote, entirely out of necessity. The debt had been real, the threat from Crane more serious than Elizabeth could have understood, and the small fiction told at the ball had been, in Beatrice's account, a kindness disguised as a deception, sparing Elizabeth the far greater cruelty of a duke's brief, careless attention followed by an inevitable, humiliating abandonment. "You must believe," the letter read, "that I never intended you lasting harm. I intended only to spare you a worse one. If the Duke's regard has proven more sincere than I credited, then I am glad to be mistaken, and I hope in time you will understand that everything I did believing it was for your good." There was no apology in it, not truly, only a careful rearrangement of facts designed to make a calculated cruelty look, in retrospect, like an act of love. "She wants me to come home," Elizabeth said quietly, when Julian had finished reading. "She says Cordelia misses me, that the household is not the same, that whatever has happened between us can be quietly set aside if I will only return and allow the matter to rest." She looked up at him. "She does not once ask whether I am owed an apology, only whether I am prepared to forgive her without one." Julian set the letter down with a kind of careful restraint that suggested he would have preferred to do something considerably less careful with it. "And what do you intend to tell her?" "I don't know yet." Elizabeth pressed her hands together in her lap, steadying them. "She is still my aunt. She took me in when no one else would have, whatever her reasons. I cannot entirely hate her for it, even now, even knowing everything I know. But I cannot go back to that house and pretend the past month did not happen either. I am not certain such a thing is in me any more." "You owe her nothing," Julian said, more sharply than he intended and then gentler. "Forgive me. That is not mine to decide for you. But I will say this much, Miss Whitmore, whatever debt of gratitude you believe you owe your aunt for a roof over your head 3 years ago, I do not believe it extends to forgiving what she did to you since. A kindness with strings is not, in the end, a kindness at all. It is merely a debt collected slowly, over years, until the person who owes it no longer remembers there was ever a choice involved." Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, turning this over. "There is still the matter of Mr. Crane," she said finally, "and my father's debt. It has not vanished simply because the lie behind it has been exposed. It is still owed, and I have no way to pay it, and I do not imagine my aunt intends to continue paying it on my behalf, not now that her scheme has failed so completely." "The debt," Julian said, with the particular flatness of a man already deciding how he intends to deal with a problem, "is a matter I am fully prepared to address. Crane extended credit to your father in good faith, whatever his later conduct. The debt itself, I have no doubt, is real, and I have no intention of allowing it to hang over your head a moment longer than necessary. That is, however," he added more carefully, "a matter I would like your permission to handle, rather than a decision I intend to make without consulting you. I do not wish you to feel that one debt is merely being exchanged for another." Something in the careful, deliberate way he said it, asking permission rather than simply announcing intentions, the way Lady Beatrice or even her own father had so often done on her behalf without ever once asking what she actually wanted, struck Elizabeth more deeply than perhaps he realized. "You are asking me," she said slowly, "rather than telling me. I find I would like to spend the rest of my life asking you, rather than telling you, Miss Whitmore, if you will permit it." He said it lightly, almost playfully, but his eyes were entirely serious, and Elizabeth felt the breath catch somewhere in her chest. "Though I am aware that is rather a large thing to say after only a month's proper acquaintance, and a great deal of trouble I have caused you in the course of it, I do not expect an answer to that this morning. I expect, if anything, that you have a great many questions for me first, and I am entirely at your disposal to answer every one of them, for as long as it takes." Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment, at the dark eyes that had never once looked at her with anything but honesty, even when that honesty had led him badly astray. At the man who had ridden 2 days without proper sleep to deliver an apology he did not have to give at all. At the quiet, careful patience with which he was now waiting, asking nothing of her she was not ready to give. "I have one question," she said finally, "for now." "Anything." "Will you stay for tea? Lucy has been asking since yesterday evening whether the gentleman in the garden was a real duke, and I confess I would rather like to see her face when I tell her he is." The relief and the laughter that broke across his face in that moment were so unguarded, so entirely without the careful composure he generally wore in company, that Elizabeth found herself laughing as well, a real laugh, the first in a month, light and unburdened in a way that surprised her with how good it felt. "I would be honored," Julian said, "to meet Lucy, and to stay for tea. And," he added more quietly as she rose to ring for Mrs. Price's small staff, "to stay considerably longer than tea, if you will allow it, until every question you have is properly answered and every wrong properly set right. It would take, in the end, a good deal longer than an afternoon. There was still Crane's debt to settle, still Lady Beatrice's letters to answer, still the delicate matter of Cordelia, who deserved better than her mother's schemes and had finally found the courage to say so. But that morning, in the small parlor of a borrowed house in Lyme, with a child's eager footsteps already pounding down the stairs at the word Duke, Elizabeth Whitmore allowed herself, for the first time in 3 years, to believe that the next chapter of her life might finally, truly, belong to her. Word travels quickly in a county as small as the one that held both Thornfield and Ashbourne Park, and it took scarcely a fortnight after Julian's return from Lyme for the truth to begin working its way, thread by thread, through the drawing rooms and dinner tables where Lady Beatrice's careful fiction had once seemed so unassailable. It was not Julian who set the unraveling in motion, though he made no particular effort to stop it once it began. It was Cordelia, quiet, overlooked Cordelia, who had spent a month carrying the weight of her own silence like a stone in her chest, and who finally, one evening at her mother's own dinner table, in front of 3 visiting families who had come expressly to hear the latest word on the Duke of Ashbourne's curious, much-discussed journey to Lyme, set the stone down. "There was no husband," she said, into a silence that fell so suddenly and so completely that even the servants paused at the sideboard. "There never was. Mother arranged it, the story, and the man at the Hartwell ball, because of a debt owed to a Mr. Crane, and because she did not wish the Duke's attentions to fall anywhere but on me. I have known for weeks and said nothing, and I am ashamed of it, and I will not stay silent any longer simply because the truth is inconvenient for my mother to hear at her own table. Lady Beatrice's face, for one unguarded instant, showed something close to genuine shock, not at the facts themselves, which she of course already knew, but at the sight of her own daughter laying them bare in front of company, with no warning and no mercy. She recovered quickly, as she always did, reaching for the same composed, regretful tone that had served her so well in Julian's study weeks before. "Cordelia is overwrought," she said smoothly. "There were complications, certainly, regarding Elizabeth's situation, which I handled as I judged best for everyone concerned." "You handled it as you judged best for yourself," Cordelia said, and her voice, though it shook, did not waver. "And I am done helping you pretend otherwise." The story, once loosed, could not be called back. Within days it had reached every household that mattered, embellished here and there in the retelling, but accurate in its essential shape. That Lady Beatrice had invented a husband for her own niece, hired a man to play the part of a claim upon her, and done it all to protect a debt and a daughter's prospects at the cost of a young woman's reputation and happiness. It was not a story that reflected well on anyone involved in its construction, and Lady Beatrice, who had spent 2 decades building a reputation for sharp-tongued respectability, found that reputation considerably harder to mend than it had been to damage. She was not received that season in several houses that had once welcomed her eagerly. She bore it in the end with the same brittle composure she brought to everything, but it was, undeniably, a reckoning, and one entirely of her own making. Silas Crane's reckoning came rather more swiftly, and considerably less gently. Julian had, in the weeks since Lyme, quietly settled the whole of the elder Mr. Whitmore's debt. Not as a gift, he was careful to specify in his correspondence with Crane, but as a purchase, transferring the obligation entirely into his own hands, where it could be dealt with according to his own judgment rather than Crane's. He summoned Crane to Ashbourne Park himself, in a meeting that lasted scarcely 10 minutes and left the moneylender considerably paler than when he'd arrived. "The debt is settled," Julian told him without preamble or any pretense of warmth. "In full. You will have no further claim on Miss Whitmore or on anyone connected to her, now or in the future. I would also advise you, Mr. Crane, that the particulars of your conduct at the Hartwell ball, accepting payment to deceive a peer of the realm regarding a lady's marital status, are the sort of particulars that could, were I inclined to pursue them, cause you a great deal more difficulty than a forgiven debt ever did. I am not, at present, so inclined. I would ask that you ensure I have no cause to reconsider." Crane left the estate within the hour, and within a month had quietly removed himself from the county altogether, his small and precarious business unable to withstand the scrutiny that now followed wherever his name was mentioned. It was Julian himself, in the end, who insisted that the final reckoning take place properly, not in a private study, not in a quiet letter, but in the open, in front of the very kind of audience that had once watched, with such satisfaction, as a lie destroyed something genuine between two people. The occasion was a ball at Ashbourne Park itself, his first as host since taking the title, and the largest gathering the county had seen in years, attended by nearly everyone who had been present, weeks before, at Hartwell's. Elizabeth arrived on his arm rather than her aunt's, in a gown that owed nothing to Lady Beatrice's charity, and the murmur that moved through the room at the sight of them together was unmistakable. Recognition, calculation, the particular hush of a county working out, in real time, exactly how the story they thought they understood had actually ended. Julian did not wait for the gossip to settle itself into its proper shape on its own. He led Elizabeth to the center of the room, where the dancing had paused, and where Lady Beatrice stood near the refreshment table with an expression of carefully maintained composure that did not, this time, quite manage to hide the dread beneath it. "Some of you," Julian said, his voice carrying easily across the now silent ballroom, "were present at the Hartwell ball some weeks ago, and witnessed a scene that I have since learned was deliberately constructed to deceive me, and far more cruelly to deceive Miss Whitmore as to my own intentions. I was told that evening that this lady was married. I believed it to my lasting regret, without ever once asking her directly whether it was true. It was not true. It was a fiction, paid for and arranged, intended to part us before either of us had the chance to discover what I now know with complete certainty. That Miss Whitmore is the most honest, the most quietly courageous person of my acquaintance, and that I very nearly lost her through nothing more than my own willingness to believe the worst on someone else's word rather than her own. A murmur ran through the room, but Julian did not pause for it. I will not pretend the past months have been easy, for either of us, or that the wrong done to Miss Whitmore can be entirely undone by a single evening's plain speaking, but I find I am no longer willing to let it go unspoken here, where the lie was first allowed to take root. He turned to Elizabeth, and his voice, when he continued, dropped into something far less suited to a public audience, and far more suited to the two of them alone, though every person in the ballroom heard it regardless. Elizabeth, I have asked your forgiveness once already, in a garden in Lyme, for failing you when you most deserved better. I am asking tonight for something rather larger. I do not wish to spend the rest of my life merely making up for the harm done to you. I wish to spend it building something neither your aunt nor Mr. Crane, nor anyone else will ever again have the power to take from us with a single well-timed lie. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The ballroom, which had been silent before, went entirely, breathlessly still. Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had ridden 2 days without sleep to ask her forgiveness, who had settled her father's debt, and faced down the man who'd extorted it, who was standing now in front of the very people who had once watched her humiliation with such satisfaction, asking her, in front of all of them, to let him spend the rest of his life proving himself worthy of her trust. "Yes," she said, and her voice, though quiet, carried clearly across the silent room. "Yes, Your Grace, I will." The cheer that went up was immediate and, for the most part, genuine, though Elizabeth noted, with a small private satisfaction she did not entirely try to suppress, the particular stillness with which her aunt received the news, standing alone near the refreshment table while the rest of the room surged forward with congratulations. Cordelia reached her first, embracing her properly for the first time in 3 years, tears bright in her eyes. "I am so glad," she whispered. "I am so glad I finally told the truth. I should have done it weeks sooner." "You did it when it mattered," Elizabeth said, holding her cousin close. "That is enough, Cordelia. That is more than enough." Across the room, Lady Beatrice watched the celebration with an expression Elizabeth could not quite read, something caught between resentment and a grudging, unwilling recognition that the scheme she had built so carefully had, in the end, produced precisely the outcome she had worked so hard to prevent. She did not approach to offer her congratulations that evening, but she did not leave the ball either, and Elizabeth, watching her aunt linger at its edges, alone and visibly diminished, found that whatever bitterness she still carried had begun, almost without her noticing, to soften into something closer to pity. She did not yet know how that particular thread would resolve itself, whether her aunt would ever offer the apology she had never quite managed to give, or whether some bridges, once burned, simply could not be rebuilt. But that question, like so many others, could wait. Tonight there was only the ballroom, and the music starting up again around them, and Julian's hand warm and certain in her own as he led her into the first dance of their engagement, in the same room, under the same candlelight, where a lie had once tried and failed to keep them apart for good. Years later, the library at Ashbourne Park had changed a great deal in 8 years, though anyone who had known it in Julian's bachelor days would still have recognized its bones: the same tall windows, the same worn leather chairs, the same quiet, unhurried light in the late afternoon. What had changed was the small, sturdy reading table that had been added near the hearth, its surface scarred with the particular damage only children produce, and the 2 dark heads currently bent over it, deep in argument over a book of fables. "It is a wolf in the story, Thomas, not a fox. You always say fox." "It is whichever I wish it to be, It is my turn to choose the animal." Elizabeth, Duchess of Ashbourne, watched her two eldest from the doorway with the particular fondness of a mother who has long since stopped expecting peace and learned, instead, to enjoy the noise. Thomas, 7, had his father's seriousness and his mother's stubbornness in roughly equal measure, a combination that made him formidable in arguments about fables and considerably more formidable in arguments about bedtime. Margaret, 5, had inherited rather more mischief than either parent entirely knew what to do with, and was, at present, attempting to settle the wolf versus fox dispute by simply drawing both animals into the margin of a book that was very much not meant to be drawn in. "They will ruin that book before supper," Julian said, coming up quietly behind her, "and you are doing nothing whatsoever to stop them." "I am enjoying the argument too much to interrupt it." Elizabeth leaned back against him, and his arms came around her easily, naturally, the gesture of 8 years' practiced affection rather than any remaining novelty. "Besides, I seem to recall a very serious young duke once telling me he found my opinions worth listening to, however firmly held. I rather think Thomas comes by it honestly." "I have never once regretted that particular weakness," Julian said, and kissed the top of her head, and for a moment they simply stood together, watching their children argue happily over a book of wolves and foxes, while the youngest, barely 2, and currently engaged in a determined campaign to climb the bookshelf nearest the fire, toddled into view with the unsteady, fearless confidence of a third child who has correctly deduced that someone else will always catch him before he falls. "Cordelia writes that she and Mr. Ashford will arrive Thursday," Elizabeth said, watching Julian scoop the youngest up before he could test that theory against the bookshelf. "She says little James has taken up a passion for frogs that is testing the very limits of her patience. A passion I expect our own Thomas will encourage enthusiastically the moment they arrive." "Undoubtedly," Elizabeth smiled. It had taken Cordelia some years to find her own happiness. A quiet country gentleman named Ashford, kind and unremarkable in exactly the ways that suited her, after the loud ambitions of her mother's plans had finally, fully fallen away. But she had found it in the end, and the two cousins had grown, in the years since the scheme that nearly separated them forever, into something neither of them had quite managed when they were younger and still living under Beatrice's careful instruction. Real friends, bound by more than blood. Lady Beatrice herself lived now in a smaller house at the edge of the county, her once formidable position considerably reduced, though not, in the end, entirely abandoned. She had never offered the apology Elizabeth once hoped for. Pride, it seemed, was the one debt she would carry to her grave without ever quite settling. But she had slowly, over the years, softened into something closer to ordinary grandmotherly affection where Thomas and Margaret were concerned, and Elizabeth had decided, somewhere along the way, that this quiet, imperfect peace was worth more than the satisfaction of a reckoning never likely to come. Some bridges were rebuilt plank by plank, without fanfare, simply because the alternative, carrying old anger forever, had begun to feel like its own kind of debt, and Elizabeth had paid enough debts that were never rightly hers to begin with. Of Sela's crane, nothing further had ever been heard, and no one at Ashbourne Park found themselves troubled by the silence. "Do you ever think of it?" Julian asked her sometimes late at night when the children were finally and reliably asleep. "That ballroom, how close it came to being the end of things rather than the beginning." "I think of it," Elizabeth admitted, "though less often than I once did. Mostly I think of the lane instead, the first one, the hedgerow, your horse nearly putting an end to me before any of the rest of it had the chance to happen at all." She smiled against his shoulder. "I think we were very fortunate in the end that you were such a poor horseman." "I was an excellent horseman," Julian said, with mock offense, "and you very nearly cost me my dignity entirely by surviving the encounter so calmly." "I have made a habit of surviving things calmly," Elizabeth said softly. "It has served me rather well, I find." Outside, the late afternoon light fell gold across the gardens of Ashbourne Park, The same gardens, the same lane beyond the hedgerow, the same county that had once watched with such eager satisfaction as a careful lie tried to keep two people apart. The lie had not won. It had delayed and wounded and cost a great deal that could never be fully repaid, but it had not won, and that, Elizabeth had come to believe, was the only ending that had ever truly mattered. In the library behind them, Thomas finally conceded the argument and agreed, with great reluctance, that the story might after all have featured a fox. Margaret declared this a victory and immediately demanded a second story as her prize. And somewhere in the warm, ordinary noise of an afternoon that asked nothing more of either of them than to simply be happy, the Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne turned back toward their children and toward the rest of a life that had very nearly never happened at all. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this Duke story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can join as a member or send a super thanks super chat. Your support truly helps us continue bringing these stories to life. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.